for joining us, and a special welcome to some new friends and neighbors of ours north of the Idaho and Montana borders. You've joined the webinar we entitled, "We Built the Data Warehouse, Now What?" So some of you know our InfoVia speakers, as we've already been doing a little bit of dialogue and some catch up. But for those of you that do not, allow me to briefly introduce them. Christopher Siegfried, with 10 years of data experience, is a technical architect or data architect on the InfoVia team. Prior to joining InfoVia, his background included construction, retail, and education. And uniquely, he is passionate about sharing his experiences and solving data problems through technical writing, an affinity many of us do not share. So a quick personal highlight is Christopher and his wife live in the beautiful town of Richland, Washington, and have a sweet and very active 2-year-old boy. Mike Migalski, who many of you know, will share after Christopher. He's the founder, chief architect or coach, and senior data guru at InfoVia. He brings 25 years of experience to customers after being an engineer, software developer, manager of engineering teams, and ultimately what I call finding what he wanted to do when he grew up in data modeling and architecture. Mike lives in Boise, Idaho, and has 4 children with his wife of 20 years. And while he's proud of all of his kids, he is especially grateful for his daughter's passion for data science and her pursuit of that education at Arizona State, which she started about a month ago. So well done, Mike, with raising a future data scientist and, of course, 3 other great kids.
Thanks. My wife would say I'm still growing up, so I haven't found out what I want to do when I grow up yet, but we're getting there.
Hey, we're all getting there in some form or fashion, right?
Kind of like data governance, which we'll talk about later. It never actually matures.
Perfect. Just so everybody's aware, at InfoVia, our mission is to bring peace of mind to growing organizations through simplified and secure data management. And we do that through 2 offerings. One is data consulting through modern data management strategy, planning, and implementation. And the other, which Mike will bring up in a little bit and highlight, is our InfoSecure product for data provisioning and user management. One note, we invite you to share questions during the presentation in the chat. We'll have an open Q&A shortly after Christopher and Mike's topics. And I will now turn over the presentation to Christopher. Christopher, thank you for diving into our topic today.
All right, thanks, Matt. So we are talking about leveraging data warehouses. So before we get to the core subject matter there, I want to bring up the types of data warehouses we have. This is a broad categorization, and it's useful to think about the scope of each of these warehouse types because it's grown, and as you might expect, the modern scope of a data warehouse has done its best to encompass all aspects of the previous 2 types. So let's first talk about your utility warehouse. Now, the idea here is that there has been a business need, and usually it's involving more than one source system. And in the 90s and in the aughts, this probably would have been an Access database or an Excel sheet, but more and more often we're starting to see people leveraging Tableau or Power BI and pull the information from these different source systems into that tool to use them there. And when this is done, it can very quickly meet the needs for that particular business requirement. We quickly generate data that is helpful for the case we're talking about. And it's so successful that the next time there's another question like that, we do it again and we target that specific business case. And it goes on, and soon you have a situation much like that drawer in your house that has the keys to your shed, and it has those little circular batteries you need once in a while, and the thing that came with your furniture to fix it. So it's a drawer and it has a lot of useful things, but there's no strict organization to it. The scope is within each tool itself. And as businesses grow, they start to look at all these great tools and they say, great, I want to use these together. And that's when you start hitting the pitfalls. You see that the data is not necessarily organized the same. The sales data may conflict from one report to another because the scope was for that individual business need and not the larger organization. So it's nice because you can add them very quickly, really gain a lot of traction, but scope is individual to the business need. And so it's hard to use all of that great collected data in concert. The next warehouse type is your traditional model. Now, these were usually created with the thought that the data warehouse is a thing that is going to be complete. We have our scope, we know sales and customers need to be put into a warehouse together, and we want the data from these three source systems to look nice. We want a golden record. We want one true source of data. And initially, this works for the scope that is intended for. It is laborious because if you're developing a golden record, you need to make sure that all the data agrees, which means that you can't represent all data from all sources equally. So you lose that grain of detail. You no longer have that source system level of detail. Additionally, you need to find the business rules or make the business rules to create that golden record and that one true grain. So the auditability and the lineage are really difficult. There's a lot of soft rules, a lot of conversions, and it's hard to tell where the data came from or why it ended up the way it did. But the good side is that once it's completed successfully, the initial scope looks great. The data is very fluid. You say, yeah, this is it. This is officially per our business rules how it should look. But again, you lose that grain. It is not pattern based, so it's very difficult to automate. And the complexity grows over a time. As soon as you try to add something outside of the original scope, you have to reevaluate all these soft business rules you put into place and say, how does this data work now that we're trying to include a new business concept or a new source? So again, we're constrained by the source we originally selected, but in a traditional warehouse, that source is likely to be multiple source systems or multiple departments. Now, your modern warehouse has learned, we have all learned over time, that data is not going to stop. You will never be done with your data warehouse. And with that, we have learned that the scope needs to be not an individual department, not an individual source system. It needs to be the entire business. So this is referred to generally as ensemble modeling. Data Vault is certainly the most prevalent, but there are Focal Point and Anchor as well. And this looks at the business as a whole and how that workflow exists. And the data is modeled after the business itself. And by doing that, there is nothing that is out of scope. It encompasses every data source, every department, anything that can happen within the business has its own natural organization in the model because that's how the business runs. So what this lets us do is have a concept. So customer would be a concept. And you have the customer concept as it exists in the business, and you build up descriptive data around that. And you're ingesting that, and you're not creating one true record anymore. You've thrown away the idea of that golden record, and you pull in all your sources and say, these are all descriptive to my customer. And so you're pulling it in, and it's raw data. So the lineage is very clear. It's very auditable. And any question you have regarding that data, you can quickly answer because it is your source system data, but it has been organized around the business, so it's very easy to parse at the same time. And since we're building it around business concepts, it's also modular. There is no reliance for customer to know what deliveries the customer had. Just by virtue of the organization, that's going to work out on its own, and you can load them independently. So it means that you can very quickly iterate and meet your business demands without worrying about the scope in the future. It is more complicated. There's a lot more objects involved because of the pattern-based building. And now this is a con that's kind of interesting because I'm going to argue that it is not a downside in the end, but you can't build it as the data team by yourself. You can't sit down, open up your source data and say, okay, I see how I'm going to build this warehouse. You really need the business input. So those are the three broadly typed warehouses. Now, moving data into a data warehouse, whether you are starting fresh or if you are adding additional data, there are a few things you can do to help yourself. You want to familiarize yourself with your data environment. And this extends not only to your source systems, but you need to think about the data you're getting back. If you have any third-party data sources or any responses from vendors, anything like that, that is part of your data environment. The guy, the poor soul, who is sitting at his computer every day, munging data in an Excel sheet 10 minutes every single day, he is part of your data environment. And the more familiar you are with your company, the more you're going to know that environment, and the easier it is going to be to have a large impact. So with that, you're going to want to cherry pick your biggest wins. You're going to say, I'm familiar with this environment. I'm familiar with Ted and what he does every day and why he does that every day. And it's going to be easy for you to find that point and say, I only have to bring in 2 tables. And if I bring in these 2 tables, everything is going to move more smoothly. Everyone will have access to this data in our data warehouse. Next, thank you. Another thing, you want to think about the warehouse as a continuous process. Like we said, with this modern approach, we recognize that there is always going to be more data. And if we're planning on always bringing in more data, then it behooves us to start thinking about how we can do this in a very consistent manner. And that's going to help us because it's social coding. Having these standards is going to mean anybody on the team can do it. You don't need one superstar who knows how the process works. Everyone can work in concert, and it's going to be something you're going to repeat constantly. So it's a process you're going to want to work on and improve. And it's important to start thinking about that pretty much right away. Lastly, consider automation tools. Now, this is going to vary on the type of warehouse you have and what kind of automation you can perform. But optimally, you are automating most of your object creation, your discovery methods. The more you can automate, the more free you are to really do the innovative and exploration aspects to make sure that the data you're getting is good quality data and impactful data. So automation really fills that gap and it standardizes. So even if you're working on a team with 5 different people, everyone is going to be building objects in the same manner. And there's not going to be any questions about how some of these very routine tasks are performed. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so leveraging your warehouse results basically in having an impact on the business. I like to think of data inside the warehouse as its own little internet. We have disconnected computers, and you can think about those as your source systems, as your data environment. But when you get it into the warehouse, suddenly they're connected. You have the internet of data. They can all talk to each other, and you start seeing results, like your KPIs are easier to track. You have an idea of how your business is working because that data is so closely related now. You can see that data in context of the entire company instead of just in its own individual system. And finally, you can start mastering your data. With the insights you gain and the KPIs you're examining, you can say, we see where our data is, if not wrong, off kilter, where we had assumptions that were incorrect, and we can start to make those adjustments. All right, so how do we leverage the data warehouse? 2 components. You want to build trust, and you want to have data availability. Trust is built when you're talking to your business users. Now, this is coming back to what I was saying about the con of, in a modern warehouse, you can't build the warehouse as just being the data team. You need to reach out. You need to talk to the people on the front lines who are doing this day in and day out and really understand the business processes. And when you talk to them, you say, hey, I'm building this. How do you talk about this? What do you do? They become part of the warehousing process, and they take some ownership in that. And so after you build the warehouse, if you go back and you review their model with them and you say, hey, we listened, we built this, that's really exciting for them. And I've seen a lot of those positive responses. So not only are they involved and they feel they have ownership, but they're aware of the data warehouse. And no longer is it this thing that is used by other people, it's something available. Data integrity. Now, this is something that modern warehouses really excel in, again, because it's going to be raw data. It is data that the users are familiar with. They're not munging into a golden record that they might not necessarily recognize, but the data is going to be what they're familiar with, and it's going to have very clear lineage. Because it is modular, you are going to be able to rapidly ingest your data using a modern warehouse. So when somebody asks for something, they say, hey, we have this business need. In the past, especially with a traditional warehouse, that could be a month-long wait or more. But with modern automation, modern ensemble modeling, you can have that done in a matter of days or a week. So you're able to meet the business more on its own pace, which again really builds that trust. Data governance and transparency are also vital. Mike is going to address those independently in just a minute. And that's finishes up the trust portion. Now the data availability, this is the other side to it. So you have people trusting the data. That's great. They're going to use it if they can get to it. Again, communication is key. We need to make sure that people know the warehouse is there and know it's accessible and that it is something meant for everybody. Low latency, we're keeping very current data in the warehouse. Even if they know it's there, if they get there and it's out of date, that's an issue. That's not helpful for them. So they need to have the data they need when they need it. And Mike is going to address these two other points, which are also very important. You need to have a history to show what the data has been, because again, some people are going to be looking for that. And security is also vitally important. If you can't share out your warehouse freely, if you're like, oh, we'd like access to the warehouse, let's run you through these checks and get you access. That's a big roadblock, and it's not worth the hassle for some people that could otherwise come in and really get a lot of benefits of this internet of data you've built. And this is a virtuous cycle. The more data you have, the more people are going to find a use for it and want to use it. And as they use it, they're going to see more areas where they're going to say, hey, could you pull this data into the warehouse? And so it grows. With trust and data availability, you're going to have more data in your warehouse, more people trusting the data, and they're going to want more data. And that is how you use your data for high impact. And now I'm going to hand over to Mike, who has some very deep feelings about those other bulleted topics.
Thanks, Christopher. Appreciate that. So data governance. Okay. We're going to talk a little about this behemoth term that means a lot of different things to a lot of people. But in reality, it means to me, once we have data organized, as Christopher so eloquently showed us earlier, that now we want to make use of it, and we want to make that use in a controlled and formal and deliberate fashion. And so we need some processes around our data, and this is not easy. It's in fact, it's very hard, and frankly, I don't really know of an organization in the few dozen organizations that I've been privileged enough to work with and in. I've not seen anyone who I would say gives themselves an A in this category, because it is hard, and it's a process. It's like climbing a hill. You never really know when you get to the top. If you ever mountain climb, sometimes there's false peaks, right? You never really know when you're going to get there until you are there. And in reality, as Christopher mentioned earlier, our data warehouse is never done, and neither is our governance process. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. It means we just need to start small and think big, and prioritize. Start with the elements as that give us the most value, that give us the biggest gains. What is causing issues in our database? Is it the lack of a customer master data object, or is it lack of data quality, or is it security, or is it some subset of all of those? And we start with one of those. We tackle it. We iterate. We make it better. We move on to the next biggest priority. We make that better, and then maybe we come back to the first one again. It's all about this continual growing and maturing process, because as any of you who've ever had your data and had the privilege of having a data warehouse or maybe building one, it doesn't end with just getting your data in one place. So how do we go about this process? Okay, once we've prioritized and we said we have a problem, let's solve that particular problem. Then we need that business engagement. Christopher kind of drove home this point about bringing data into the data warehouse, but it also applies to the governance of the data warehouse, and that is that we need stewards. We need people that are typically outside of IT in the business that will take ownership of this, of their piece of the puzzle. And this is a plural term. It's not one steward, it's stewards coming from each of your business areas that you're serving. They take ownership, they're involved and actively involved in defining how you're going to use the data, what data needs to be available, what the business vernacular or terminology or vocabulary is for that data, and how to turn that data into information, right? Translating it from just pure raw data into terms and objects that the business can use to solve problems and answer questions. And again, a key in this process is to automate wherever possible. And we specifically like automating based on metadata. Create data about your data, like transformation rules, like source system lineages, like documentation, that helps us with the automation process, that helps to do something automatically that we otherwise would do manually. If it's worth doing twice, you have to consider that it's worth automating. Look for patterns and build templates, whether that be patterns around your process, patterns around your code, your ingestion, and oftentimes transformations that need to happen to the data. And automating helps us not only speed up the process, but it helps add quality to the process because we're doing things consistently over and over again. It's that standardization that Christopher talked about earlier. Okay. So with governance, as I mentioned, like climbing that hill, start with a small piece, but with the big picture in mind. I often talk about the first 1,000-piece puzzle that anyone ever introduced to me. I remember my aunt had one on her table and we would go visit her, and here's this puzzle, and it's all these pieces strewn out, and maybe she has the border put in place, but you really can't tell what that picture is. But look over here, there's a puzzle box. And that puzzle box is the big picture. That's what we're building. That's what we have in mind. We have to have that think big, vision in place. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it has to give us an idea of where we're going. Whether that be your data model, maybe you've scratched out a bunch of business models, business objects on the whiteboard and drawn lines between them. That's a big picture. That's starting to build that puzzle box cover. It might be all of your different master data objects. We'll get to this in a second. Just listing them out. Here's all the things that we think we might eventually need to master. But you have to have that big picture, and then you can start picking off pieces of it, starting small, building prototypes, building data, I don't want to say solutions, but snippets, building queries and quick little prototype reports for your business to help them get insights into the data that you have in the data warehouse, and then get their feedback so that you're iterating based on that feedback, adding value, adding capability into your warehouse, and then delivering solutions often so that that feedback loop stays active and vibrant. Again, we mentioned metadata, because if you gather data about your data, then you can create things like your model from your metadata. You can even generate your data warehouse objects. We use a tool called Warescape, and there's others out there. There's other challengers in the market now that help you create or even discover data about your data, and then use that to generate your data warehouse objects themselves, the tables that drive your ingestion, and the load logic itself as well, whether those be procedures or scripts. Those can be generated oftentimes because, frankly, there's only so many different patterns for loading a data warehouse. I mean, there's not that part is not that complex. If you've been down this road for a year or two, you've seen all the patterns. We're either, we're either sourcing from change data capture, we're doing a full table load, or some type of incremental load. And so those patterns can be leveraged with metadata so that your people, as Christopher mentioned earlier, are spending their time doing things that only people can do and not things that the machines can do. And you're using machines for generating code, and it's higher quality and it's faster this way as well. We had a client, a couple of years ago, it was in 2019. They were an international publicly traded consultant company that failed to build their own internal data warehouse. And they reached out to us, and in the matter of a few months, with automation and generation using metadata, we were able to build a data warehouse for them that tied out $32 billion in revenue, transaction by transaction across, I think, half a dozen different currencies, tied out to within a penny, 1.02 pennies. And so that is a testament to the ability to build a warehouse with metadata and code generation. And you can even create your user-facing views with that approach as well. And we'll get to this a little bit later as we talk about the InfoSecure product that we're going to introduce to you, and generating views that become what the user needs them to be. An additional benefit of the master data approach is, as Christopher mentioned earlier, when you're transparent about your data, you're building trust. And so involving your users in the model building and then making those models available, putting them up on the wall, printing them out, and drawing on them and interacting with them between your IT team and your user team helps build trust. Knowing what those transformation rules are. How do you compute revenue for our company? What is considered profit? What are our key performance indicators? And what are the rules for building those? What do we want to call things? What are the right names for these columns? And then where do those columns come from? What source tables do those derive from? Where are the translations applied? And then how do those build into the objects that are available for the users? If you're transparent about that process, your users will trust your data and they will use your data. If it's opaque and a black box, there's an innate mistrust to that. So metadata and code generation plays into this, because if you have metadata sufficient to generate your code, wouldn't it make sense that metadata could probably be sufficient to generate your documentation as well? And so we use the Wordscape tool set and others to generate documentation that is not only accurate, but up to date. Because there's nothing worse than out-of-date documentation. And other than Christopher, nobody likes to write documentation. So, or not many technical people like to write documentation. So having it be generated is a win-win for everyone. So let's get some concrete examples here. We've been talking pretty high level, and we want to get down to some actual examples. So one of your governance processes would be mastering your data. Okay, so we've got some examples over here. It might be a set of facilities, or your materials, might be your customer list, or just defining your workforce. What is the product? What are our offerings to our clients? Do we have a distinct list of everything that we sell? Can I run a query and find all my orders? And who knows or can define what revenue means to any given part of our organization? Okay. And realize that you're okay here. No, don't feel like you're behind. No organization is perfect. I know some publicly traded companies who have their worker organizations defined only in spreadsheets and nowhere else. So Excel is the master data tool of choice, or by default, I guess, not necessarily of choice, but the default master data tool. But it doesn't have to be the end master data tool. There are tools out there that can help you. first you have to convince somebody that you need to do this. And usually it's obvious to the people working in the trenches, but if management needs to see it, your data warehouse can help you, what I say, paint the ugliness. You can run a query in your data warehouse and say, see, we've got in our list of customers, we've got Mike Migalski and Michael Migalski, and we think that's the same person. And this is kind of a problem. And we need some technology, some fuzzy matching, and maybe even some data stewards to pour over this list and help us reduce it down to the true distinct set of customers. Okay. Same with workers, same with product. All right. But you have to paint that ugliness first and make the problem obvious. And bringing your data all into one place inside your data warehouse is a key first step in painting that ugliness. Next, again, we're kind of repeating ourselves here, but prioritize. You're not going to get all this done. And I know some Fortune 100 organizations that have never mastered even the objects that I have sitting here in this list. So you start with the ones that are most impactful and most valuable to your business. Leverage your stewards for this. They know where the source of customer is. They can tell you whether the CRM or your ERP is a better source for your customer. And they know what transformation rules and what vernacular or vocabulary to use to define the columns that define what a customer is. So leverage them for that. And did we mention we should automate as much as we can? If we have a rule for where the key source of the data is, well, then put that in your load scripts. If we have a naming convention, then put that in your metadata and automate it to the extent possible, whether it be coding it or putting processes in place and tools that help to make that a consistent and repeatable process. Okay. Another example. I told you here's some concrete examples, and this is kind of a segue into the security tool that we want to introduce you to today that we offer. Security. Security. Nobody likes to talk about security. Security is always the thing that happens after everything else is complete, which is never. And we only do security when either we're dictated by a government organization or an industry oversight committee or something that we have to do it. But the reality is we have a lot to protect. We have the personal identity of our employers and our employees and our customers. We have financial information. If you're a publicly traded company, certainly that's extra sensitive. We have our intellectual property, and we're constantly under this state of go faster, stop, go stop, right? Protect data from all the threats, minimize our risk, but go faster and get data to those people that need it. And those people sitting over in that corner of the room, they need this data set, and we don't have time to think about whether they should see column X, Y, and Z. We need to give them A, B, and C. So just give them the data set and we'll figure it out later, which never actually happens when the cat's out of the bag, right? So this go stop scenario always happens, but we're here to tell you that there is an answer, that productivity for your workforce and keeping your risks low can happen simultaneously. You can do both. With all these chaotic demands for your data and constantly changing regulations, multiple sources, inconsistent governance, and complex technologies, there is an answer. And we call that answer InfoSecure. InfoSecure is a solution that originated back in my days at Micron, where our CISO walked into my desk one day and said, stop the data warehouse. It is too powerful. There's too much information in there, and our intellectual property that tells the world that tells us how to build our product is being leaked to the Chinese, and we think it's by our own employees. Shut down the data warehouse. And it was true. We had employees that were selling our secrets to the Chinese. And so for about 10 days, we shut down the data warehouse. And what we came up with was a solution that was metadata driven. It was automatable. It was intuitive. In other words, users didn't have to think about how to use it. It was low code and technology agnostic. It was easy for our team to implement. It was easy to manage because the policies were built in metadata, and it was configurable. so that as requirements changed, we could make the changes in metadata, and those changes would be reflected in the end objects that users were querying. In addition to all that, it turned out that the approach we took, where we put it right in the database, right next to your data, it leveraged the database as an engine for applying security. And the optimizer was aware of who could see what data. And so oftentimes the queries actually perform faster with security than they did without, because we could determine, or the optimizer could determine, because of the metadata, that this particular user only needs to see 10 of those million rows. So let's go get those 10 and return them to him and not worry about the other million or 999,000. So it's fast, it's easy, it doesn't require any new technology, it runs on practically any relational database platform, and on the cloud or in-prem. And it works also on the key modeling paradigms like Data Vault and star schemas and third normal form, some of the things that Christopher mentioned early on in the presentation. InfoSecure it has some business benefits too, not to mention the easy access for all users that we mentioned earlier. If all your users get access to your data warehouse, and you can be confident that they're only seeing the data that's appropriate for them, how easy is that? How productive is that for your workforce? In fact, the same CISO that told us to shut down their data warehouse, after we had implemented this approach, came in and said, okay, open it back up to all 50,000 users of the data warehouse. Wait a minute, 50,000? Yeah, that included employees, that included subcontractors, that included partners that weren't even within our organization, but they had a login because we had a reason to share data with them. We could open it up to all of them, because with multi-use filtered views over our data, we could be assured, and our CISO could too, that any given user could only see the data that was appropriate for them. It was consistent in that the policy enforcement applied to not only reports and dashboards, but also any machine learning models or even ad hoc queries that ran directly against these user-facing objects within our data warehouse. The consistent policies were enforced across all those downstream objects. And it was future-proof in that we could change the metadata about those policies and be compliant with changing regulations. We could grant or remove access at the row and column level with a few clicks of a button. And that was life-changing, especially as things like GDPR and the California Consumer Protection Act started coming out, and we had to change who could see what data. Then we could make those changes essentially on the fly in many cases. In addition to the business benefits, there's technical benefits in that it's scalable. If you roll to a larger database, it just goes with it. If you're on the cloud is your engine, so it's literally limitless. And it's optimized, as I mentioned earlier. The queries perform sometimes faster than they would without security. It is platform agnostic. In the solution that we've implemented in InfoSecure's current revision, it runs on ANSI SQL code. So when you move from your on-prem to the cloud, you just lift and shift and move this with it, and in a few hours, you're up and running with the same security you had on your legacy solution. In fact, it can be ported to multiple solutions to run simultaneously on all of them. If you wanted to run it in your source systems as well as your data warehouse, you could do that too. And it's easy to implement. I got a call from New York University, I don't know, 18 months ago. And the person said, I have an audience with the CIO tomorrow morning, and I would really like to show them InfoSecure because I think they're going to use it. But I'd like to show it in their environment. And I literally stayed up and had a working prototype running the next morning. Took about 90 minutes to set up just a basic use case, but they got to see InfoSecure working in their environment with their data, and they're still using it today. Okay, so in summary, we'd like your feedback, first of all, but we'd like to just reiterate that iterations are the key to governance. That when you're building a data warehouse, or you're implementing governance, or you're tackling security, that starting small and thinking big and delivering often is the key. Be metadata driven. Know about your data and track it in metadata. Not only does it help you move faster with higher quality, but you can report on it as well. How cool would that be if your auditor came and said, I need to see your security policies in your data warehouse. And you said, oh, okay. And you run a report, and here are your policies because they're available in metadata. Be transparent. Kind of goes with the metadata approach, but be transparent, not just about your data, but also about your metadata, and also about your models and your translations that feed that metadata. Automate wherever possible, and that's made possible by a metadata-driven approach. And then, of course, use InfoSecure. Here's the shameless plug. Use InfoSecure for your secure data provisioning. And with that, I'll turn it back to Matt.
Thanks, Mike, and thank you, Christopher. We do have a question. Tim, you want to ask that question of Mike and Christopher, and we'll get some answers. And please, you can certainly. We also open up the Q&A now to anyone who would like to ask a question, either in the chat, or if you want to wait for a little space, just unmute and let's have some dialogue. Thank you.
If anyone's still awake.
Yeah. Yeah. So Ryan's talking about row and column access control. He asks, does it enforce policy business rules on the queries being run by analysts or users at runtime?
Yes. At execution, at query execution time, it says who's the user, what roles do they have, what policies are in place for those roles, and how does that interact with my data to produce the set of rows and columns that are appropriate for that user against that data set. So essentially you run a select star from the InfoSecure view, and it produces the data set that's appropriate for that user. Of course, you can additionally filter that data down further, but only the data set that's appropriate for that user in row and column filtering is produced at query time.
Gotcha.
As one of our clients put it, it's magic. It isn't, it's actually set theory. It's math, but we'll take magic. Good question. Another client said, I had 20 reports that all did the same thing, but they were just filtered for different use cases. Now I have one. Feel free to shoot questions verbally as well, if you don't want to type them in the chat. If you're bold, we've tried to leave plenty of time for questions, and we're open to feedback as well. Dare I say, even criticism?
Yeah, actually, well, Mike, I'll mention that right now. One of the, just so everyone on the call knows, InfoSecure is a product that has been released in 2021, and we are still very much in the early stages of customer onboarding with a few publicly traded companies. But we're listening and we're learning. I'll share a quote from Simon Sinek. He said, "Listening is not understanding the words of the question asked. Listening is understanding why the question was asked in the first place." So we are very much in that mode, and we would absolutely welcome the opportunity to present InfoSecure to you in a greater way, but to understand your reactions, questions, and we welcome your feedback. But does anyone else have a question regarding either current business challenge or something that you want to ask related to our topic today?
Yeah, just one more. Is this InfoSecure goes in over a data warehouse? Now you configure that over one warehouse. How do you then get that across all the warehouses in a, public company or something like that? Does it just propagate across, or how do you connect?
When you say all the warehouses, do you mean if you wanted to apply the same security policies on multiple platforms? So a couple
Yeah,
ways
like
to do
like
that.
across the enterprise. Yeah.
Yeah, a couple ways you could do that. The first would be you could deploy that metadata through replication or ETL into each of those systems and then create user views on each of those other systems. Or you could use a data mesh or a data fabric. And interesting, that comes from Ryan over there at Zetaris. We could create a virtual warehouse across those spaces that leverages the InfoSecure metadata in a virtual fashion, so that all the queries that come through that virtual platform play by the same security rules as well.
Gotcha. There you go. Makes sense now. Ding. All right.
I thought it was a leading question, coming from you, but but it was a good one. It was a good one.
Yeah, good stuff.
Micron used the same metadata. Now, let me clarify. Micron didn't use InfoSecure. Micron is where the idea for InfoSecure birthed. Okay, we've implemented that idea in several companies as a service. Healthcare companies and insurance companies as a service, and only this year have we productized it into something that's, installable within your environment without a high cost of service going along with it. So Micron used this approach on their source systems as well as their warehouse, because obviously if you can run queries through the back door and get at the data, then your data isn't secure at all. So it was implemented on the sources as well as the data warehouse.
Dave, not trying to call you out. I see you're not on mute. Any questions or comments regarding our discussion today?
I think I'm just excited to learn more about it and to potentially schedule some time for that. So great presentation, pretty exciting.
You wanted to know if it had run on Sybase IQ, didn't you?
Nope, not anymore.
I think it actually would, although I doubt we will ever have the opportunity to find out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Certainly, it's making me think about some other database platforms like Snowflake.
Absolutely. Snowflake is probably Snowflake and SQL Server are our main targets, but it's ANSI SQL, so it's going to run on any platform that supports views and joins, even Hadoop Hive. Trying to, if you've got some data lake / schema on read approach, there was one instance of it implemented there as well.
Great.
It's only going to perform as well as the underlying infrastructure, right? So, yeah.
And it's exciting to hear about. So in terms of a distributed database environment globally, it sounds like it's absolutely capable of being deployed in that kind of an environment.
Yep, sure thing.
Okay, well, if there are not any other questions, Dave, thanks for that interaction. If there are not other questions, we thank you for joining. You've got a few minutes left before a potential 1 o'clock meeting that you may have or other duties on your Wednesday. Happy middle of the week. Enjoy the remainder of your day, and thank you for joining us for this presentation.
We look forward to hearing any feedback via email as well, if you think of something after the fact. Thanks, Matt. Thanks, Christopher.